the first true vertebrates were fish. The organisms that had a bone inside their body mass, and they attached muscles to it so they could do things that were very useful, like move. So the original invertebrates, they had what we call sessile or non-moving lifestyle on the seafloor. So the advent of moving on the seafloor was tremendously helpful for these organisms. So we started off with a tunicate with an early embryonic vertebrate that was resorbed, and then we moved into this early fish-like organism that we call a conodont, which we have very little of the skeleton preserved, but we have a lot of the teeth preserved. And these conodonts make for the perfect biostratigraphic fossil that's used throughout that Cambrian fauna for the Cambrian and Ordovician and Salernian time periods. So, but then the question is, what's the next step going from this kind of proto-fish called the conodont into true fish? So the first true fish were organisms that had no jaw. They were fish-like. If you saw them, they looked fish-like. They had, head, tail, fins, but they had no jaw. So their heads were different too, because with no jaw, that means you have to have a permanent opening, a mouth, and that mouth has to be open all the time because you can't close it and shut it. So it's kind of like a small torpedo with a big open end, and its strategy was to move forward and either shove the mouth into sediment or shove the mouth towards something it wanted to prey on. And then lined inside of that open mouth all the time were these little hooks, kind of early types of teeth, and that way whatever got inside couldn't be released and get out. So it was a different kind of body plan than we think of for the normal fish. The other thing is that the musculature and the ability to swim was just being evolved early on in these organisms. So they took a different strategy. They decided to go into ultra defensive mode, and they built a fortress. In other words, they made a skeleton that was on the outside as well as the inside. So we call it armoring. These were vertebrates, again with the backbone and the chevron muscles, but they created helmets around them that were fused together scales. So basically they were armored. They were like a small tank with an opening that was permanently available at the front end of the tank, and they would just move through the water. Now, their musculature and their fins were very poorly developed, so they were also awkward, poor swimmers. And then this armored head, and sometimes the entire body was armored, made for a very awkward and slow-moving machine in the water masses at these time periods. Now, another thing that had happened at this advent of the jawless fish was that they transitioned into creating skeletons that had a lot of phosphate, so they were phosphatic skeletons. Phosphatic skeletons are still the type of mineral that modern day fish use. In many places around the world, fish bones are ground up and then spread across fields as a fertilizer because phosphate is a great fertilizer. So it's something that we still utilize all the time, but the beginning of having a phosphatic skeleton took place in this Cambrian Ordovician transition, and the jawless fish were the first ones that had that. And as you can see from some of these images of the jawless fish and reconstructions, they were quite unique. And it was a body plan that was effective for defense and apparently just enough so they could get the food they wanted, but it wasn't an overly effective type of approach. And as the armored heads and shields of the fish were evolved through time, as you can see here, some of them developed these huge points at the front end of the mouth area, and the mouth would modify and move down and make kind of a slit. So it wasn't just a big open cave at the front of the head. And you can see in this lower picture here that you almost got these, like the grimace, right? You had these really grotesque looking smiles that were developed by having the ornamentation around the lower part of the shield of the fish. And then the eyes were actually sunken into the shield. So they were looking out through a shield. So actually quite terrifying looking organisms that were starting to evolve. Now, the next step, of course, in the process is that we want to be able to have jaws. And the jaw evolution story is the following, that the early fish, one of the things that defines fish is that they have a gill. And the gill is an apparatus that's evolved that's very good at extracting oxygen that's dissolved in water. So water passes along the gills, and then the gills have multiple very intricate, highly fluted surfaces that allow the oxygen to be taken out of the water and then utilized by the organism. Now, of course, we have lungs, and lungs we don't fill with water, right? So we fill them with air, and then we extract the oxygen from that. So it's a very different process. But in these early organisms, the gill was the mechanism to get oxygen. So all the jawless fish had gills. And there is a lot of fossil evidence, as we can see from this diagram, that the gill structures themselves and the bone apparatus that was developed to support the gills, so the gill supports, that those eventually through time they evolved to become more efficient to get more oxygen out of the water. And as they became more efficient, the thinking is that they became larger and more robust, and they actually moved position in the structure of the fish. So they were moving, getting larger, and finally they fused together. So we think that the earliest jaws were a series of gill structures that ended up getting larger, moving slightly forward in the head, and then becoming fused. And then eventually those fused gill structures provided support. Musculature started to develop along the gill structures, and then that's what allowed the final development of a true functioning jaw. So the ability to have a jaw revolutionized fish completely, and we call the Devonian time period the age of fish, because that evolutionary development reached its zenith in terms of actually having finally a true functioning jaw in that Devonian time period. Now, there's one more step here we need to think about at that same time of going from gill supports that fuse, and then musculature attaches, and then we actually form a true functioning jaw. And that is a process that's biochemical, and we call it anaerobic glycolysis. It sounds like a difficult series of chemical concepts, but it's actually pretty straightforward. And I can tell you that all of us practice this every single day of our lives. So if you're an organism that uses muscles, which is us and many other types of metazoans, every time you use your muscles, every time you go through muscular activity, your muscles consume oxygen. And they consume oxygen because in the process of using your muscles, you break down sugars. And so you metabolize the sugars in your muscles using oxygen. So the problem is that when you are at a stage of using your muscles when you have plenty of oxygen available, then the process moves forward quite easily. But the oxygen that's available within your musculature that is delivered by the blood is reduced dramatically locally as soon as you start moving. So muscle use means that you consume the oxygen. Well, what happens is as soon as you get to an oxygen deficit, as soon as you start using up a lot of the oxygen and you're, again, breaking down the sugars, one of the byproducts of that metabolic process, in this case, is the production of acid. So in other words, the pH, the relative acidity of the solutions that are bathing your muscles, as you go through an oxygen deficit, the acidity drops. And we all do this because our bodies cannot, the blood system cannot provide an infinite supply of oxygen to your muscles. So what happens is that we use our muscles, we consume oxygen, we consume the sugars, and then we make the local environment acidic. Now, when the local environment becomes acidic, remember what the muscles are attached to. They're attached to bone. So if the muscles were attached to a bone that was made out of calcium carbonate, CaCO3, if you add a little bit of acid to calcium carbonate, it dissolves. So it's not a good strategy, right, to have a muscle skeleton system where as soon as you use these robust muscles, you dissolve your own skeleton, right? I mean, that's the ultimate negative feedback. So what was adapted during evolutionary biology was that the fish transition from a more calcitic skeleton, which is very sensitive to a small drop in pH, to a phosphatic skeleton, which is much less sensitive to a drop in pH. So the phosphatic skeleton, and ours has been modified into a more appetite-rich skeleton, which is another form of a resistant skeleton to these drops in acidity. It didn't solve the problem of oxygen deficit. In fact, that's one of the reasons we get tired when we exercise or play sports, is that we are constantly going through an oxygen deficit using the muscles, and exercise allows you to build up your muscles to reduce the effects of the oxygen deficit. But the really important thing was that evolutionary biology provided us with a phosphatic skeleton in the fish. And therefore, by having their everyday normal activities, they weren't dissolving their own bone structure. So that was fundamental, and that was as important as the development of the jaws. So suddenly then we had the ultimate predator. We had an organism that had advanced muscle systems, fins had developed, it had lost a lot of the outer armoring. Now, one of the biggest fish that we know of in the fossil record is an organism called a placoderm. And that placoderm, as we can see from this image, it was huge. The jaw is on the order of a meter high, if not more, and then a couple meters in length. So if you stood in front of this, basically one good bite is your entire body. So the placoderms were quite phenomenal. And one way to think about the scale of a placoderm was, here's a good image of a placoderm hunting a shark. Now sharks came on board at that time period, and they have a different kind of musculature. And also a different kind of bone structure. But the important thing in this context is that the placoderms were an alpha predator in the oceans of the Devonian. And they were immense. They were on the order of 20, 30 meters in length. One of the jokes I always make is that we're very lucky as humans that we evolved when we did. There's been many large predators in the world's oceans, but having large predatory placoderms would have prevented basically all ocean water sports. So swimming and sailing and scuba diving, these would have all been activities that would have been virtually impossible because of the high rate of predation that would be done by the placoderms. And you can see in this image that the placoderms finding snacks, right? Its next lunch target is a gigantic shark. So the placoderms were serious predators, and they rose quickly because of their musculature, their phosphatic skeleton, and this incredible jaw system. And the thing about the placoderms that I think is especially interesting too is that they kept this very, very well-armored skull that we see. And so they had the predatory capabilities, but these really strong defense capabilities. So this sequence of evolutionary events then brought us to the moment then of having a fully orchestrated group of predatory organisms called fish. And that restructured fundamentally then the communities of animals and plants that were living on the ocean floor and set the stage then for the transition from the Cambrian fauna then into the Paleozoic fauna. And part of that transition was going from the more rudimentary jawless fish then directly into the jawed fish. And by introducing a predator that was so capable at these time periods, predatory pressure actually drives evolution and diversification, just like we saw ice sheets, just like we saw meteor impact. So evolving and establishing predators is another major event in an ecosystem evolving forward.